So in order to demonstrate trust, you say that one needs to be fully transparent, and you alliterated a few examples of what transparency might mean, the data source, how it's transformed, etc. Where might that information be held, and who would manage that information? Should it be in a publicly available space, do you think?
Well, some of it needs to be in a publicly available space. So when I advise people about what they should be thinking about if they're going to submit real world evidence to a regulator, I tell them there are three elements they have to pay really close attention to. One is good study hygiene. The second is rigorous study design, and the third is a rigorous analytics plan. And under good study hygiene means that they have to post and pre-specify what their protocol and analysis plan is in advance before they do any of the analytics. So whether they put it on clinicaltrials.gov or the EU PASS registry or the new registry that's on Open Science Foundation, you have to convince people that you are not data dredging looking for a good answer, that indeed you had a question, it was a hypothesis testing question, and that you specified it, and that you had told people how you intended to investigate it. Mm-hmm. And that needs to be on a publicly available website. Now, other things also need to be on a publicly available website, like when you report out the results of your study, you have to be completely transparent in your execution. So we know that when we do many of these studies, we do a feasibility analysis to see if there's enough patients in a data set to do a question. But then we get in and do we find all the covariates we need or whatever, and you have to modify your analysis plan. Well, if you do that, you have to document that you modified your analysis plan and say why. And that needs to be, again, publicly available, whether in a report, in a peer-reviewed paper, or on a registry. And finally, there has to be a way to track what is done back to the original data source. So just like the FDA and other regulators require traceability to original data sources, they're going to require traceability to data sets. Mm-hmm. So we know that there was an example a couple of years ago during the COVID pandemic where there was a data source that led to publications in both NEJM and Lancet, and that they had to be withdrawn because it wasn't a real data set. So you need to be able to somehow, and the question is, what does that look like? What does that traceability look like? Do you have to get your hands on the analytic data set, or do you actually have to get to the original data source and be able to query it to convince yourself of the adequacy of that data source? So good study hygiene is the first part. And then there's rigorous study design. The entire question is, can you draw causal inferences if you want to make a claim about effectiveness or efficacy? And we haven't done as much as we need to be doing routinely to do that. So one way to do that is to take the target trial approach that Miguel Hernan has proposed, in which when you design your real-world evidence study, you first design it as you would as if you were doing a clinical trial. And then you try and come as close as you can to emulating that clinical trial as you possibly can do. And if you do that, you're more likely to be able to have a study that will be able to do causal inference. Another thing we often don't do is that we don't put our studies into a causal analysis framework. And there are several frameworks that have been put forth about causal analyses. And there's some recent work people are doing in which you can look at observational or real-world evidence studies to see if they fit into a causal analysis framework. But I think they should explicitly sponsors and researchers should explicitly put their studies into a causal analysis framework. And finally, there are tools that are being put forth that can help researchers not make silly mistakes. So the Harper framework was recently proposed by a joint task force of ISPOR and ISPI, and I was privileged to be part of that, in which it goes through and makes sure you ask all the questions as you design and begin to think about doing your research so that you don't make silly mistakes. One of the things that has come to the fore recently is that, yes, we need to be worried about confounding and bias, but some of the biggest mistakes have been due to flaws in study design, in not identifying time zero. And that was the case with hormone replacement therapy, getting different results between RCTs and observational studies in terms of their cardiac benefit to postmenopausal women.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, the third piece is rigorous analytic plans. And they have to, as much as they can, account for bias and confounding. And not only the stuff that is measured, but really you should say, here are other things that we think could be confounding, but we haven't measured them. So how you do a residual analysis to see how much of confounding is left is important, and how you do sensitivity analyses to see how much the confounding may have changed things are really important. And again, here, some of the ISPOR, ISPI Good Task Force reports are very useful.